Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Paccoa for inviting me to speak with you today. I have spoken to groups of Paccoa members in Western Australia, but never interstate before. So, oh, okay. I'm a trifle shorter than David. I might just mention here that I actually went to university with David, and he used to entertain us in social history tutes the way he entertained us this morning. And it was so delightful to hear him let loose once more. It's been several decades since I've heard that type of presentation. Thank you, David. Okay, so this morning I'm going to be talking to you about familicide. And familicide, as you can imagine, is no laughing matter. It's a very serious offence that causes multiple deaths, usually of very small children under the age of 10. So because of that, I just need to warn you that the contents of this presentation may be distressing. So what I'm going to be talking to you about this morning is looking at the descriptive data derived from 2 studies that I did in Western Australia of familicide, looking at the common psychosocial antecedents to the familicide, so you can see my social work background coming out here, looking at the common myths surrounding the offence, and then what I consider the most important part of my work, and that is developing a hypothesis about how these risk factors translate into the offence. I'll be presenting a schematic representation of the path to familicide that comes out of that hypothesis, and to make some recommendations for policy and clinical practice. And finally, just talk to you very briefly about some of the things that are happening in Western Australia at the moment. Like Tasmania, Western Australia often gets kind of left off the map, not in terms of the actual map, we're always on there, but people often forget about us. And over there, people frequently talk about seceding from Australia, which nobody really thinks is a very good idea. But certainly, Western Australians often feel that we're very isolated from the rest of the country, and so it's a great opportunity for us to talk to the rest of Australia about the sorts of things we're doing over there, to share our ideas, but also, most importantly, to hear from you. And today I welcome any discussions that anyone would like to have with me after the presentation about the work or anything else to do with community corrections. As you heard, I began my career in corrective services, initially in prisons, then in community corrections, and I guess I have to say that my heart is still in the field with you people, where I know the work is always difficult and always under-resourced. And for me, I don't think there'd be any point in doing research unless it could translate into the field where you people are working. So the data from the study came basically from 2 studies, and the total of offences was 9. Now, as you know, familicide, thankfully, is not a frequently occurring offence. And many people think it occurs much more frequently than it does because it gets so much media coverage when there is an offence. And perhaps I should just also tell you that there are basically 2 kinds of familicide. The first familicide occurs when a man shoots his children and his wife, or uses some other means, very often it's using a firearm, following some kind of loss of status in the community or some community shaming. The kind of familicide that I've researched, and the one that I'm talking to you today about, is the other kind of familicide. And this is the familicide that occurs after a marital separation, a relationship separation. The couple may be married, they may not. And this is where the children are killed, but the wife is not. In the first kind of familicide that follows community shaming or loss of status, the wife is usually killed as well. Following separation, wives are very rarely killed. I'll also be talking about the perpetrator using the male gender term, because this kind of familicide is very, very rarely committed by women, but it is occasionally committed by women. So don't make the mistake of thinking, as the media often does, that this is only an offence committed by men. We've had 2 cases in Western Australia where it's committed by a woman. As you can see, the victims in the offences, children, were very young. Most of them were under 7 years of age, and all of them were under 10. The mode of the homicide varied quite a bit. Carbon monoxide poisoning, of course, was the most common. It's very easy to secure children in a car to kill them. It's a lot more difficult to kill them using other means. So this is the most common form of killing, but very often the children are sedated or restrained before they're killed. There was one case in Western Australia where the perpetrator had actually restrained the children in the car using handcuffs made out of, you know, those garden ties that you use to tie up your tomatoes or whatever. And he'd sort of manufactured these little handcuffs to hold the kids into the car so that they couldn't run away. But in spite of that, one of the children, the oldest boy, had realised that the father was planning to harm the kids, and he tried to run away, but the father had found him and brought him back. When the police found the vehicle with the bodies inside, they saw the scuff marks around the car where the little boy had tried to escape. There were 2 cases where the children were stabbed, and in that case the woman was also killed, and that was rare for this kind of familicide. So again, most of them are just carbon monoxide. There was one case where the children were gassed in the car, but they were also stabbed to ensure that they did die, and then as the police arrived, because they were chasing this man, they realised that he was intending to kill the children. He tipped petrol over the car and set it alight, and then tipped the rest of the petrol over himself and self-immolated in front of the ambulance people and the police. So that was a particularly horrific end. In spite of that, one of the children from that offence was rescued by the ambulance people and police, and did survive, I think, for a couple of weeks, but it eventually died because of the extent of her burns. There was only one case of shooting. Both those children were shot in their family home as they slept beside their mother. Having trouble with this. Okay. So a lot of media coverage in the past has focused on the fact that a lot of men get frustrated because they don't get contact with their children following separation. And just to clarify this a little bit, I looked at the data to see where were the children when they were killed. So 15 of the children were actually on access visits to their father, and most of them were unsupervised access visits. But where the access was supervised, it was supervised by a family member. And what we know is that families where there's a history of violence, people have had similar socialisation, so that indicators of risk aren't recognised by supervisors, and they don't see the dangers in the perpetrator that someone on the outside might see. So 4 children were killed in their home, and 2 were abducted from school. And of course, typically the mode of suicide with the fathers was similar to that of the children. So only 2 men survived their suicide attempt. Familicide perpetrators are very good at killing themselves, and it's very, very rare to have the opportunity to interview a survivor. I was fortunate enough in the second study to interview one man, and I tried to get some information from him about how he thought he had come to this act. And he just looked at me and he said, "Carolyn, I've been talking to the psychologists in this prison for a long time now, and I'm still asking myself the same questions you're asking me." So he was quite unable to explain it. So again, even after doing lots of interviews with surviving family members and with this one perpetrator, which was very rare, I was still left with the puzzle that I first encountered when I was working in Canning Vale Prison in Western Australia, and that is, what can drive a man to kill his own children whom he professes to love? And that's what actually drove me to do the research, because I worked for many years in the prison counselling a man who'd killed his kids in this way. He'd also tried to kill his wife and had tried to kill himself unsuccessfully. And so this was something that puzzled me. As a very new social worker, I'd ask more experienced practitioners, can you explain this to me? What's the psychological background to this? How does it happen? And no one could tell me. When I talked to the man himself, he explained to me his history, and as I began to understand some factors in there, I started to get some ideas, and I think he did as well, because just before he got transferred to minimum security, he said to me, "Thank you for helping to understand how this happened." He said, "I know now that if I'd had a different childhood, I might not have committed this offence." So this was not something I'd said to him, but once again, and this has happened to me many times in my career, and I expect it has with you people as well, I learnt from my client what my profession was unable to teach me. So when I looked at these cases, I found there were definitely common factors. One was the obsessiveness in the perpetrator, and this was quite extreme. So there was one case where the man used to go off to work, white collar, go off to his office. Before he went to work, he used to check the kilometrage on his wife's car. During the day, he'd ring, "Hi, hun, how you going? What are you up to today?" He'd make little notes. She was unaware of this. When he came home, he used to check the kilometrage on the car again, work out what she'd said about her movements during the day, and then calculate whether it matched. And if it didn't match up, if there were more kilometrage on the car than would equate to her stated movements, he would become very abusive to her. But it wasn't until after he died that she realised that he'd been keeping these close notes on her. There were two men who actually hid in the ceiling space of the wife's house after they separated and watched their wives from spy holes in the ceiling. So we're talking about very extreme obsessive behaviour. There was one man who camped outside his wife's house and just observed her movements for weeks, and the police would move him on and then he'd come back again. Finally, he was actually in the roof space of the house watching her. She heard a noise, called the police, they removed him, and this is going back a few years, and he was just told to get a bus out of town and not come back. And that was in spite of him breaching a restraining order. This was in a country town. So another factor was the perpetrator's sense of omnipotent control and their jealousy related to their wife. So they wanted to know everything that was going on with them and would not allow them to leave. There was one woman who tried to leave, and her husband tied her up, gagged her, and just went off and left her in the house for hours before he returned, and she was quite unable to move, quite terrified. Another common factor was a deterioration in the perpetrator's mental health following the separation, and this is a critical factor in trying to understand the perpetrator motivation. So people who had appeared not to have any mental health issues previously and maybe had not had substance abuse issues following separation became depressed, became very angry, began to use drugs that they'd never used before, or began to increase their alcohol consumption to very serious levels. There were also many reports of the perpetrator's threat to harm himself. "If you don't come back, I'll kill myself." There were also threats towards both the woman, the partner, the ex-partner, and the children, but the way that they were conveyed to others was in a very veiled way, so that the threats were not necessarily heard as threats. So after the children died, women would remember the husband saying things to them like, "What would you do if I took the children and didn't come back? What would you say if I got the children so you can't have them?" That kind of thing. But afterwards, the women realised that this was actually a threat of homicide, but at the time it wasn't realised. What they were often hearing was a threat to suicide, but not the homicidal threat. But as we know, when there's a lack of individuation in perpetrators, as there very often is in cases of domestic violence, if you hear a threat to homicide, you really need to hear the threat. If you hear a threat to homicide, you need to hear the threat to suicide, and vice versa. If you hear the threat to suicide, you must also check out for the homicidal component. So, unfortunately, the conceptualisation of familicide has been compromised because of the kind of myths that have built up for many years in the community. And a lot of this gets fanned by media coverage and also by men's groups, the men's confraternity and other groups that push the injustice of the family law court system in terms of the way men's issues are treated. So myth number one is that familicide is caused by a court dispute. But actually, I found that only 2 couples at the time of the murders had existing court disputes. 4 couples had never been to court at all, and 3 had no current matter before the court. So what that means is they might have gone to the court just to make a consent order about what was happening with the children, or they might have been through the court process, but the court thought there was an agreement or there was a verdict. But actually, when you talk to the survivors about it, really the perpetrator had never accepted the so-called agreement, in inverted commas. Sometimes the woman hadn't accepted the agreement either because she felt coerced by the court process to reach an agreement, even though she felt that the children having contact with the husband was a risk to them. But this was very interesting, and this got teased out by talking to people. It wasn't available just on the files. Myth number 2, that familicide is caused by a frustrated lack of contact with kids. But in the case where the children were abducted, it couldn't be determined whether the man had legal access or not. So some of these cases, I was just looking at newspaper reports. Some I was looking at mixes of corrective services data, family court data, and survivor interviews. But there were 1 or 2 cases where really I had very little to go on, so there was some information I couldn't determine. But the result was that in 8 of the cases, the men had very regular contact with their children. And all except 1 of these used the contact time to kill the children. So I think that pretty safely dispelled that myth. Myth number 3 is that women exaggerate or invent domestic violence so that they can get more of what they want from the court process. And I think Thea Brown and colleagues really put a stop to that kind of thinking initially with their report on the Magellan Project. But there's still a lot of this thinking around. Following the Magellan Project, or around the same time, Paul, Karen and I in Western Australia developed the Columbus Project, which looked further than child abuse. It also looked at domestic violence issues in the family court, and we proposed a model of differential case management which would tease out these cases where there was a history of DV and child abuse and manage them differently. But at the time that many of these cases went through court, there was no such program. So what we found in these cases of familicide was that very often women themselves didn't recognise the domestic violence. They were ignorant to it. So, for instance, the woman that was tied up and gagged said, "Oh no, he didn't hit me." And then when I said, "What did he do when you tried to leave?" she explained what happened, and of course there was significant violence. Another woman said, no, he didn't hit me, he just used to throw the furniture around. And once he threw a wardrobe at me, but he wasn't violent. So very often, as you know from your work, the partners of violent people grow up in a violent context. So very often they don't recognise what's happening to them as violence. They see it just as the normal. This is what goes on everywhere. So what we found was there was deprivation of liberty, a lot of stalking, including the 2 cases where the men were hiding in the roof space, destroying property. One woman had her car totally destroyed when the perpetrator got in a rage about something, and he just kicked the car and beat it with his fist to the point where it was absolutely undrivable. He broke every window and smacked in every panel of the car. Threats to kill, a lot of social abuse. No, you can't go and visit your sister, she's just a bitch, she'll fill your head full of rubbish, you're not going there. No, your family can't come and visit, and this sort of thing. So that women were typically very isolated from their traditional support systems. And, of course, economic abuse. Myth number 4, just because there's DV doesn't mean that children are at risk. Well, of course, now we know that they are, and the Family Law Act has recently been changed to incorporate other kinds of abuse to be considered, particularly emotional abuse, in court cases. And we know that living with DV is emotionally damaging to kids and can have very long-term effects on their personality development. Not just because of the abuse that they experience, but also because when their mother is living in a situation of domestic violence, she's very often not emotionally available to the child. And so what happens is they're growing up in a situation where there's complex trauma experienced, not just through the actual shouting and the violence that occurs, but through the relationship between the primary carer and the child that's damaged by the context. The effects of this can be enduring and pervasive, and often start to go across the generations. So a child that grows up like that very often has their own parenting compromised, and that goes on through the generations. So you see this kind of thing in your work. Now, where was I up to? Myth number 5, familicide is spontaneous. But actually, there's no way that familicide can possibly be spontaneous. And my research proved that for the first time, because what I found out from talking to people is that someone had to manufacture a hose pipe that would at one end be the size of the exhaust pipe of the car, and at the other end be small enough to fit into a tiny gap in the window that was wound down just to accommodate that, to let the carbon monoxide come in. And that takes quite a bit of time and effort to do that. One has to purchase materials to sedate children so that you can keep them still long enough to hold them in the car while the gas takes effect. So there's no way that this is not a premeditated offence. If you use a firearm, which is rare in this offence, you have to purchase it. So there's no way that it's not premeditated. I guess in the cases where the access was supervised, again, there had to be a plan developed to take the children away from the supervising person, so that there would be a pretext developed to get the children away from scrutiny long enough to save the alarm being raised, and would give enough time for the children to be gassed. So again, very, very premeditated. There was one headline, or I've seen a couple of headlines, where they actually talked about the man's love for his kids, but actually we know that murder is the most extreme form of violence, and it should never be romanticised, because the motivation for this may not be primarily to hurt the children, but there is a very malevolent motivation, and it's usually directed at the woman. And the children are sort of like a byproduct in this. So there's no empathy or compassion for the children. And how can that be part of a relationship that any sane person would refer to as love? So we know that prior research, Thea Brown and Federico said that family court clients are a very skewed population, that 50% are characterised by domestic violence and child abuse, and we do know about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. But this is where I think it gets really interesting, and this is where it really grabs me, and I hope that you'll find it interesting as well. If we take Bowlby's work and we know and accept that attachment forms the template for future relationships, and we know that for there to be secure attachment, the primary carer needs to be not just physically present, but emotionally present as well. And we know that domestic violence, mental illness, substance abuse and child abuse may compromise attachment. Some forms of attachment typology, such as insecure and disorganised, are highly correlated with specific psychiatric diagnoses. And what I should say here too is that none of these people had a psychiatric or psychological report ordered. The ones that went to the family court, no such report was ever called for, in spite of the way that some of them behaved that showed signs of great disturbance, like hiding in people's roof and spying on them. We know that common sequelae from early childhood abuse, consistent with the behaviours exhibited by these perpetrators, were hyperarousal, dissociation, suicidality, affective dysregulation, relational disturbances and self-harm. So we're seeing that the perpetrators exhibited these behaviours even though they hadn't had a psychiatric assessment. And we know that this group of behaviours are consistent with early childhood abuse. We know from the work of Bruce Perry and Alan Shaw and Alert Nienhuis and many others that the right brain is the region that's mostly affected by childhood maltreatment. And we know that those pathways in the right brain are involved in emotion and motivation processing, together with the control of aggression. And this is important. This is also the part of the brain where empathy develops in children. Okay? Compassion and empathy for others is part of the right brain function. We know that early childhood abuse has been demonstrated to correlate with brain variances, and compared to controls, children with abuse-related PTSD have been shown to have smaller brains and damage to the brain throughout those parts of the brain. So we know that. So this is part of the context we have in trying to come to terms with the motivation or understanding the offence. So together with my colleague Mark Satchman, who supervised part of my PhD, we came up with an idea that what was happening for these people was actually a kind of a dynamic process. So for instance, these men might at times appear to be behaving quite normally. They might at times appear to be good citizens. Most of them held jobs. I would put them more in the category of white-collar worker than blue-collar worker, so they were different in that sense than homicide perpetrators. But we know that those kinds of early backgrounds that I talked about have long-term effects on the personality development, usually type B, so we're talking about personality disorders. We know that chronic PTSD comes out of this kind of background as well, so accumulation of abuse. We know that they have problems in initiating, developing and maintaining relationships. And we know that the capacity for empathy and compassion is often severely compromised. We know that when they're stressed, emotionally stressed, particularly stressed by abandonment of a primary love object or the partner, that they can regress to infantile ways of functioning. And I mean emotionally infantile. So we know they can't differentiate well between the self and the other because of the way their personality is formed. They have an inability to cope with abandonment or a perception of emotional abandonment. And they have a lower order of defensive reactions. So they use things like projective identification and splitting to cope. And we know they're also vulnerable to acting out, often violently. So these cases were characterised by a refusal to accept the finality of the separation, refusal to comply with court orders, so there was lots of stalking and contact even though there were restraining orders, breach of VROs, stalking, highly litigious behaviour, emotionally charged allegations and counter-allegations. So one man was accused of sexually abusing the children, so he put in a counter-allegation of exactly the same, and that went on for a very long time in the court. Lack of empathy and compassion, and a history of threats to harm the other and the self, including the children. So what I'd like to share with you now is a hypothesis that I developed with Mark Satchman, and it presents a new conceptualisation of the dynamics present, and it's based on unconscious motivation of perpetrators to survive the assault on the psyche that is posed by emotional abandonment. It enhances current theories of domestic violence by including what is known about the psychological process of attachment and the neurobiology of trauma. And I propose that in familicide, it is the lack of individuation that makes it difficult to separate, and that also increases the risk of lethality to the other and to the self. So if you now have a look at these figures, I'll see if I can work the little... No, I can't, but it doesn't matter. Can you see the... you can see... There we go. See figure 1. So we're talking about the man in relationship, but he's a man in a relationship who has had a history of early childhood trauma such that it's affected his personality development. He can't cope with relationship breakdown. He only feels whole when he's in a symbiotic relationship with the other. And it's usually mutually dependent because he doesn't just get in a relationship with anyone. He tends to get in a relationship with someone who's had a similarly traumatic background themselves. So moving on to figure 2, the wife in most cases is usually the one who precipitates the separation. Even though she may have similar dependency needs to his because of her background. She may have tried to leave before, maybe several times, but returned because of her own dependency or because of threats. The loss of the other causes the man to feel not whole, so he's gone back again. Feels not whole. So because he's feeling not whole and not in a relationship, he's feeling that he doesn't exist as a person. And so he becomes consumed with thoughts of retrieving the other. He has to get her back, whatever the cost. So this fits very well, I think, with the theories of domestic violence used in the Duluth model and so on. It's not inconsistent with any of that. It's actually quite complementary, I think. So he tries to get her back. And in those attempts, he might try promises, threats, and very often stalking. But what I would do using this model is I conceptualise that the stalking is actually a pathological need for him to have omnipotent control of the other. And it's manifested in a form of proximity-seeking behaviour that has its origins in the infant's need for symbiosis. So it comes out of his early childhood trauma. He doesn't feel whole unless he's joined. So this is why it can lead to breaches of violence restraining order, and I think it also explains in some ways why some men continue to breach restraining orders even though they may be punished for it. They will still breach them, maybe 15 times, because the stalking isn't actually a conscious driven behaviour, it's actually coming out of trying to meet an unconscious need for the symbiosis. But in saying that, I'm not saying we should excuse it, because someone who consistently breaks VROs, we know, is highly dangerous, and it's extremely frightening to the victim for these things to happen. So we have to take it very, very seriously. But I guess what I'm saying is that if we understood it a bit differently, maybe we would actually be able to work better with people who do breach restraining orders, because these guys are very, very high risk. And it doesn't mean, because at the beginning of a court case, and I'm talking about family court, you might assess a man as being low risk, but because his regression is actually determined by what's happening in the relationship, it's not static, it's a dynamic factor here. they may need to be watched very closely to determine at the point at which they become dangerous. So if you look down to figure 5, realisation, this is the time when he realises she's not coming back. So this explains, I think, in some ways why some researchers previously found familicide perpetrators were their motivation that was described as depressed. Other researchers found that the motivation for familicide came out of a wish to retaliate against their partner. Ken Polk found in his sample that there were some who were depressed and there were some who were retaliatory. And I think my model explains why they can both occur at the same time. So it actually has to do with the personality problem that the person has and the way they regress. So what happens when the woman doesn't come back is he splits off the part of himself that feels all bad, which is the depressed part, and he projects it onto the source of his pain or disequilibrium, which is the other, his partner. Thus, depression and rage exist simultaneously. The threat to the insecurely attached perpetrator is experienced most intensely when he sees there's no chance of reconciliation. So all the time he thinks he might get back, he may not commit the offence, but once he realises that there's no hope, that's when he becomes highly dangerous. And I think that is why, it helps to explain why some women who are in very dangerous relationships will say, no, I will keep having contact with him. I'm never going back to him, but I'm going to tell him there's a chance, because if I keep him on a string like that, it's safer for me. And I think for someone who hasn't been in a relationship like that, it's very hard to understand that reasoning. But again, I think this model really kind of explains that as well, because the woman has an intuitive understanding of just where he's at. It also explains why in familicide sometimes it occurs directly after separation. So some of my cases, the homicide occurred less than a week after separation, but then in other cases it didn't occur for a year. And I think the factor that was underlying that was, when did the man actually realise that she wasn't coming back? So in the one where it was just a few days separation, the woman said to me, well, I'd left him heaps of times before and I'd always gone back, and he knew I'd always gone back, but things had deteriorated to the point where this time I actually knew I was never going back, and I think he picked that up, and that's why he killed the children, to punish me. So moving on now to figure 6, the lethal solution. What I'm proposing is that in familicide, this emanates from a coexisting depression in which the self is feeling all bad, which is the suicidal part, and then there's the retaliatory rage as well, which is expressed in filicide, because the only way you can hurt someone worse than killing them is to kill their kids and let them survive. And I think this also explains why in familicide following separation, women are very rarely killed. They're usually allowed to survive, whereas in familicide following community shaming or loss of status, the women are killed as along with the children and the suicide of the perpetrator. So I guess the thing now is, what is the way forward and the challenge to practitioners? So it's a very complex situation, and I guess simplistic solutions are never going to resolve it. I think for my whole career I've been someone who's argued very strongly for interagency collaboration and cooperation, sharing of information. It's essential. I don't see how we can manage cases if we don't talk to one another about them. And I'd just like to share with you, because I know we're running out of time, a little diagram. Again, I devised this with Mark. If you go to the very top of the chart up here, if someone is exposed to early childhood risk factors, such as trauma from living with violence, disrupted attachment, emotional neglect that comes out of that, they can move on to early childhood and adolescent attachment typologies, which you'll often see in juvenile justice. Yeah? Going down here to adulthood, what you see there is the expression of personality dysfunction, very often cluster B varieties, borderline personality. I don't know what proportion of people in jails or the criminal justice system are diagnosed with borderline. There's a lot more that meet the criteria that never get diagnosed. Thank you. So this goes on then, with no intervention, to behavioural risk factors like obsessiveness, pathological jealousy, domestic violence, a deterioration in mental health and threats. Add to that separation, which comes out of this, so the relationship is fraught, the woman decides to leave. You have a potential for familicide with that kind of person. However, if with those risk factors, again, there's no intervention and it doesn't go on this way, there's not a separation, so the woman stays, you get intergenerational transmission of trauma. And again, what you get in the next generation is here. So we're back to square one again. And I guess you people see this all the time. I know when I was working in the family court, not me because I wasn't sort of there for as long, but there were some people who'd been in the family court for 10 or 15 years and they were starting to see the children that they'd done children's reports on when the court first started as parents of children needing to be interviewed for another generation of reports. So I think that was a very interesting thing from a practitioner's point of view, but I know we all see that. I know when I worked in jails, prison officers would say to me, oh, his dad was in here 20 years ago, you know, and he was the same sort of person. Well, why not? You know, the context is the same. Why wouldn't it produce the same sort of factors? And I know there's variations to it. Not every offender, not every child of an offender is going to become an offender, but certainly the context doesn't help people to develop in a healthy way when they're living with this kind of violence. So just moving on, I think some of the implications for policy is for us to work together collaboratively, for there to be sharing of information not just interdepartmentally but intradepartmentally as well. And that really where we need to be putting, I think, a lot of our money is to more effective programs for child protection. I mean, so often I teach at University of Western Australia and I teach in a graduate certificate in child protection, and I hear about the cases that they have to close because they don't have the resources to deal with them. And those cases are cases that have children that are highly at risk at times. But because of the deprofessionalisation in child protection and the dwindling resources, they're just being closed. And I think really this is what it comes down to. It's too late very often when someone's at the point of homicide or suicide. If we can get them early, then there's more of a chance. So in Western Australia, there is a growing awareness. They're quite well informed now in the family court over there about the risk factors for familicide. There's a growing awareness in the court about domestic violence, but it's still not really where we would like it to be. We do have a child protection worker based in the family court. I don't know if you have that in other states. Our court is different. But there's a lack of resources to enhance therapeutic jurisprudence. So the kind of differential case management that Paul Carolyn and I dreamed about when we set up the Columbus project is gradually getting eaten into by resources. And I think there's a growing awareness in the media about the facts of familicide. But really we do need to look at interagency risk assessment and ongoing risk management process if we're going to avoid these kinds of offences. The other thing we have over there is a child death review process which is situated in the Ombudsman's office and that advises government on trends in these kinds of issues. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Are the questions to come later or? Other questions?
Well, we'll have, if you are willing, on our panel this afternoon.
Sure, yeah.
But if there are any questions, we can take those.
Can I just ask a very quick one? Caroline, you mentioned that familicide is not spontaneous.
Yeah.
And the reasons around that. And we see a lot of this in the sexual offending
Yeah.
domain as well, that appears opportunistic
Yeah.
crimes, and people throw that word around
Yeah.
as if all of a sudden it comes out of nowhere. And we use the term planned impulsiveness, which I think would probably make sense to you as well.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, did you come across any cases, or have you heard of any cases where domestic violence did not precede the act of murder? I just wonder, because it seemed that there was always a case or instances of some form of domestic violence. I wondered if that had happened where there hadn't been.
I have heard of cases where initially it was put out that there was no domestic violence, but in every case I'm aware of, further investigation or disclosures later down the track indicated that there was domestic violence. So I think initially either people are reticent to speak of it, or, as I said earlier, they still are not recognising that non-violent forms of domestic violence are actually domestic violence. Yeah. Okay, thank you.